One of the things the advisory board talked about in looking at themes and challenges and opportunities in our market right now was what we ended up calling the outside-in rebellion. So some of the forces that are coming in from outside and that are creating some healthy tension. And so we've got three remarkable people that are going to address you on the topic this morning. They are slideless and going to carry on a conversation, and I know you're going to enjoy what they have to say. To introduce this group, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Scott Hines.
Great.
Scott.
Thank you so much. Well, good morning, everyone. How are you doing today? We're very excited to be here, and today is really intended to be a dialogue. We're going to begin with just a few little opening remarks with each of us and pose a few questions to the group, but really it's a conversation with you. So we'll have a question and answer period, so be thinking about what you might want to ask. I'd like to introduce some of my esteemed colleagues who are here with us today. Linda Burch, to my left. Linda is the Chief Education and Strategy Officer at Common Sense Media. I'm not going to go a whole lot into each of our bios because we're in the conference book. But Linda is quite an interesting individual. She is the co-founder of this organization. And one of the unique things that they're doing right now at this nonprofit is they're going out and they're evaluating a lot of the education technologies and gaming apps and offerings that are available to consumers and beginning to rank them and give the marketplace an idea of the quality and caliber of these programs so that particularly parents and teachers as well can evaluate what's good and bad and separate the wheat from the chaff. So if you're a person who's creating new technologies or applications for the consumer market, you want to be really nice to Linda here at the conference. Also with us today is Howard Lurie. Howard has a very esteemed background. Most recently, he's been working with the edX group. That is the Harvard-MIT collaboration, one of the major MOOCs, massive open online courses that's entered the marketplace in the last 2 years. Howard is now a free agent and is out doing some pretty amazing consulting work, and we're also very excited to have him here with us today. My name is Scott Hines. I own Hines Global Education. I've also done quite a lot of work in the MOOC space with a new startup called World Education University, and we'll be moderating the panel today. Now, the purpose today and what we're going to be talking about really is what are some of the market drivers that are really challenging some of the traditional educational business models and technology offerings that are out there. We're specifically going to be trying to peek into the future and identify some of the trends that you might be interested in as entrepreneurs or venture capitalists so that you can be one step ahead of the competitors. You know, most of the innovation is really happening in the distance learning and online markets, but that's not to say that there also isn't some great innovation happening outside of the Internet. So as we get to our question and answer period today, feel free to ask questions really on a broad range of categories, and if we don't know, we'll tell you we don't know, but maybe somebody else in the audience who hears your question might be able to meet up with you later on. We will have an audience Q&A, as I mentioned, but I think I'd like to start today with posing a question to the audience. Why did the cannibal's son get expelled from school? Does anybody know that? It's because he was buttering up the teacher. And then when he got sent home, you know, he was at the dinner table that night with his mama cannibal and his daddy cannibal, and they were grilling him like most parents would when their child gets in trouble at school. And Mother Cannibal had just put a clown on the table to eat for the night, and the son just got himself into more trouble when he looked at his mom and he said, "This tastes funny." All right, so all that to be said, we're not taking ourselves too seriously up here. We're holding ourselves out as experts in the field, but we really want to have a good time today. So I'm going to begin by just identifying or introducing Linda, and I'd like to have her kind of go through some of her thoughts on what is new now next in education. So Linda, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. I am delighted to be here, everyone. I am a newbie to EdNET, so I would have been standing up at the very beginning of the initiation of the meeting. I am the co-founder of Common Sense Media. We are a nonprofit based in San Francisco. We have offices in New York and in D.C. and in L.A., and we are all about helping families and kids and now educators navigate the digital world safely and responsibly, and we also are believers in harnessing the power of technology for learning. And so I come to this, the title of this talk is one that I feel very aligned with. I am neither an educator or a technologist, but someone who has entered this space relatively recently and is very excited by what is happening. So I'd like to speak a moment to what we're doing and then turn to what I see as the big challenges and opportunities in the space. So we as Common Sense Media, we do three things. We rate, we educate, and we advocate. And the rate piece is something that many of you in this room might know about. We are an organization that does ratings and reviews of all kinds of media, from movies to apps, on age appropriateness. How many of you here in the room know of who we are and what we do? Great. And we do that based on a rubric that we developed with child development experts. We now have 3 million unique visitors per month coming into our website. These are largely parents. We also have about a quarter of our traffic coming from mobile. And in addition to people coming to our website, we actually distribute that content on all kinds of media platforms. We have 25 major media partners: Time Warner Cable, Comcast, Netflix, Amazon, that carry that content into over 100 million homes across the country. So that is the way most people know of us. We are a consumer reports guide to media for kids and families. What you may not know about us is that we have, in the past 3 years, launched a new initiative that is looking at the learning potential in interactive digital media. So games, apps, websites, digital courseware. We started with this in the consumer space, hoping to highlight for parents the learning potential in media that they can access at home. And over the course of the past 2 years, we've developed a pretty rigorous rubric around looking at learning potential in terms of engagement, pedagogy and learning design and feedback, which we can talk about later today. And we are looking at products that are both in the consumer space and things that are intended for K-12. So think of Minecraft as a potential learning product, or Portal as a game. And then think of Dreambox, and think of Motion Math in between. We think the most exciting things may be happening at the interstices between consumer and K-12. And that program is something that we began with funding from a philanthropist in Chicago named Susan Crown. And we developed the consumer version of it and launched it last year, April 2012. Very quickly, we were asked what could we do in terms of K-12 and creating a platform for educators. And Bill Gates, through BGC3, which is his private philanthropy investment firm, that was the way he first invested in Khan Academy, last December said, we want to partner with you, invest in creating a platform for K-12 and for educators. That's called Graphite, and we just launched it at ISTE in June, and it's out there. So what I want to say about this is that I think in this field of ed tech, Karen did such an amazing job of highlighting the opportunities and some of the challenges up front. But this question of discovery, how do you know in a world where digital content is exploding what is really of quality, what's good? How do you help teachers and parents discover the hidden gems that are out there, curate their own learning content? How do you help them share in this world of connected teachers and parents where the walls between home and school are falling in a very interesting way? That's what we have put ourselves out to try to help do in combination with a lot of leading experts in the field. So that's what Common Sense Media is about. Karen also mentioned that we have a K through 12 digital literacy and citizenship curriculum that is now in over 55,000 schools across the country. There are 100,000 educators that are enrolled in using it in classrooms. It is free. Our belief is that every single child in America, by the time they reach 8th grade, should be digitally literate. And no matter what kind of school they're going to, what zip code, what kind of technology base they have, they should learn these skills of how to be safe, responsible, respectful users of technology. That is a prerequisite to all of us that believe in embracing technology for learning. It's the way that parents are going to get comfortable with technology flowing into schools. It's the way that kids are going to be able to be self-learners and navigate on their own. And so we see these two things that we are doing today, providing digital literacy and citizenship, which helps kids develop the behavioral skills to be online, as well as helping teachers and parents find the great content that's out there that engages kids to enhance learning.
Great. Thanks, Linda. You've given us a lot to think about. I already have a few questions for you.
Great.
So, Howard, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure.
and what you're seeing as the future.
Great. Well, it's great to be here, and thanks, Scott, for moderating this, and thanks to EdNET for having this conversation. I come at these questions a little bit different than Linda, as an 18-year veteran of working in a variety of e-learning ed tech companies. My roots are really as an educator, but the branches leaves certainly as an innovator, entrepreneur, and so I've seen a lot of changes. I think I'm at the point where I've seen so many conversations happen several times earlier. I must be getting some mileage there. One of the things, three things I really want to talk about, sort of three truths I want to try and hold to be self-evident today that we can talk about. We're looking forward to a conversation with you. One is to talk about platform. One is to talk about classrooms, the coin of the realm, obviously, that Karen talked about and blended, and one is to talk about content and resources. And my recent experience building that rocket ship while we're flying it at edX has very been helpful. It's a great lens to look through, as well as my prior experience. So I think these are sort of three broad trends I wanted to talk about. Hope we can engage in the discussion. First of all, in terms of platform, and we throw these terms around a lot all the time. And one of the nice things, I think, helpful things about EdNet, and I hope for this session, is to sort of pause and really think through what do we mean by these terms and what do we mean by the opportunities. Certainly there's been this gold rush land grab mentality that has been fostered in the last sort of, I'd say, 12 to 18 months has really been accelerated. Our experience at edX was pretty unique. It was a massive, 1 million learners through courses in less than 12 months. We grew from 2 universities to more than 30 universities worldwide. And at the end of the day, it really is an effort that's driven by device, really by machine learning environments, by auto-grading innovations. And I think the first learning and the first sort of truth I wanted to hold out is that these are important steps, and obviously many folks here in this room are innovating as well around machine learning and auto-grading and assessment and data. But in and of itself, those a revolutionary classroom do not make. And I think that it's a reminder for all of us to think through, also almost to some degree, almost like an opportunity cost, that we can have these incredible revolutionary platforms. But at the end of the day, there's a space that needs to be filled between the creators of content, the creators of courses, and the actual delivery systems. Many of the providers, the early stage providers of MOOCs, and in fact, that term has been bandied about so many times, I still kind of cringe when I hear it, because I don't know if it's the massive part that's important as much as is the data. But these new platforms are going to drive new opportunities. And those opportunities really are around how do you work with institutions, that it could be K-12 districts, they could be state educational systems, they could be colleges, universities, they could be not-for-profits, to help them stand up the kind of courses that will have long-term learning and learning impact. I think that's the unwritten chapter, and I think that's an opportunity that is really not been filled yet. There's new models of content licensing, new models of distribution that have not been figured out. And I think this first stage, or the first couple of innings of this platform mania that we've been through is really that. It's just the foundational build. So we're excited, folks I'm working with, to look at the next stages and the next conversations that are going to happen. Related very much to this is the whole question about classrooms. And so the coin of the realm, blended classrooms, we've heard about them before. As Karen said this morning, it's not new. And I loved her line about the unadvertised occurrences, the question that someone asked. We don't really want to see blended classrooms as a return to marching kids back down to that computer lab, which we've all done in our past. I as one of them. My learning, or the truth I wanted to come back to is that blended is actually a whole nother way of thinking about teaching and learning. And so Candace Thill, who's out at Stanford, if you don't know her work, I would strongly encourage you to look at her work. She helped start the Open Learning Institute at Carnegie Mellon. Candace is a learning engineer. And she describes it as saying that actually blended really is rocket science. It's as complicated as trying to figure out those types of analytics. It's not as simple as just layering in a set of digital resources and then expecting that your average K-12 classroom teacher or higher ed teacher will be able to affect significant change for teaching and learning. So I think there the opportunity is on new models of research and new models of professional development. The teachers who are coming into our classrooms expect some type of codified, modularized, blended environment because, in fact, they themselves may have learned that way back in college or graduate school. And so it does require, though, I think, and it's an opportunity for new models of thinking about professional development and what we do with them. Just citing some quick examples, the recent San Jose State study that came out on communities of practice, one of the massive open online courses that was done both with Udacity and with edX, they really found that the faculty said, I need help doing this. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing. And that becomes an opportunity that I think we could all take advantage of. Finally, talk about content. It's open sesame time. And the question is, how do we define open? And that conversation has been filtering through this group and certainly has been on the blogosphere in the last month or so. These are obviously really exciting and really daunting times for people who produce content. I think there are a number of exemplars that are out there. There's a debate now about what is open, how open is open. So I would encourage you to look at David Wiley's work or Audrey Waters' blog, tweeted a few weeks back about what she called open washing, a real critical take on some of the new open learning adventures that are out there. So the question is, what actually, when the rubber hits the road, how open is something really going to be open? And I think this becomes a larger question around OER, obviously, in Creative Commons. Where does this come from? There's now obviously an increasing range of tools and resources for anyone to create content, but it raises the question of, can everyone be a publisher? And I was in a position of working both with publisher folks and OER folks, and that was constantly a refrain and something that is really an unresolved question. I think we have to listen to the publisher folks and go back to their expertise about how they do their craft. And finally, related to open, and again, echoing a little bit what Karen said, is this is time to drive forward and march towards that interoperability, to make sure that the content that is produced, the data can travel. The whole notion of a portfolio or something that can transfer with a student throughout his or her K-12 experience and potentially help them make decisions about what the rest of their educational path is going to be. It seems so logical. It seems so essential. So the ability for data systems to work together, obviously, I think is going to be critical. I would encourage people, individuals, companies to not have that kind of brass ring mentality to say, well, if we build a platform that does both OER and proprietary content and we can monetize that, then that's a solution. I think it's more complicated than that. So these are just some things that have occurred over the past, occurred to me, and I'm happy to share the conversations. But I would think it revolves around platform issues, questions of professional development and blended, and questions around content and open and how open is open.
Great. Thanks, Howard. I'll keep my remarks very short because I want to get into the questions here. I've been thinking about this, and I think some of the trends that I find particularly exciting are a little bit different, focusing on more the business models and where we're heading as companies and as entrepreneurs, as I filter that through the lens of an education entrepreneur. One of the exciting things that I'm seeing happening is really a blending that's occurring at the corporate level between nonprofits and for-profits. We've always had this very distinct wall in the education community between the for-profit education community and the nonprofits, and both sort of look at each other a little suspiciously sometimes. But what we're beginning to see now is states who are passing legislation to create new corporate structures that are blended models of the two. Vermont was the first to do it, creating a new entity called the L3C, or basically a corporate entity that blends LLCs with 501c3s. I actually have formed now 2 of my subsidiaries as L3Cs. For corporate law purposes and for tax purposes, they are treated by the IRS and state entities as for-profits, LLCs. But what is unique about them is that per IRS rules, they are eligible for grant funding from foundations through program-related investments. So for those of you who are here at foundations, you know that 5% of your money each year has to be put forward in PRIs or more. And now you're able to tap into entities that have a social justice mission founded by social entrepreneurs who are doing socially beneficial things with their companies in the world and meet those regulatory requirements, but also are turning a profit, and in fact can be quite profitable as long as the socially beneficial mission is put forth first. I think we'll see more and more of that, particularly in the education field, because there are so many people who want to do good. And as you see the millennials in particular begin to rise up and form their own companies and dominate our industry, this particular generation is very motivated by making a difference in the world, not just money. And you'll see more and more L3s crop up, which will blur those lines between for-profit and nonprofit. If you'd like more information on these, you can go to a website called AmericansForCommunityDevelopment.org. AmericansForCommunityDevelopment.org. And they have some great information on that. The Lumina Foundation has done quite a bit of research around L3Cs as well. I also think one of the trends that we're going to see really blow up, particularly with the advent of learning analytics and big data, is really the spilling over of the privacy wars into education and online education. And we just watched this national debate that's ongoing with the NSA, looking at our phone records. It gets really scary as a parent when you begin to realize that school applications are tracking every keystroke of your child's movements and what they're doing and how they're doing it. And so I think we'll begin to see companies popping up that look to sabotage data collection to protect the privacy of children. And those that are trying to collect that data will have to then combat that. We see that in a lot of consumer technologies, and I believe that is a trend that we will begin to experience and have to talk about in education as well. I also believe that we're seeing really radical shifts in pedagogy brought about by adaptive learning, create your own adventure games that are education related. And we're shifting away, even in the K-12 market, from traditional pedagogical approaches to more what I would consider andragogical approaches, where you have independent learners. For many years in online learning, we drew a line between K-12 and higher ed and the pedagogical or andragogical approaches between the two. We assumed that adult learners are independent and self-disciplined and can maneuver their way through an entire course on their own if the content is set up in such a way to allow them to do that. But more and more what we're finding is that children have that capacity as well. They've grown up with it. You know, I handed my iPad to my, at the time, 6-year-old daughter with a time-telling app, and within a matter of days she had taught herself to tell time. That was really unheard of, to have a child of that age be able to have the self-discipline to move through that type of content and learn from it. So I think as we begin to rethink our pedagogical approaches, we're going to see a real disruption in traditional pedagogy. And then finally, globalization is something that we've talked about for decades, of course, but there's some really exciting things happening, and if you're an entrepreneur in the room, you really need to start thinking outside of the boundaries of the United States, because there's opportunity there for you. And that comes really in two areas. One, I believe, is market penetration of mobile devices. You know, we're seeing now, for example, in Latin America, we have over 300 million people who have smartphone devices in their hands. And these are not the traditional affluent people. These are middle income and even lower income people who are walking around with iPhones. And that's opening up a world to them that they've never had before. China is really the place to go right now. And I think it's actually evidenced by the fact that we have a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs and companies attending this conference. And we've not seen that all that much in the past at EdNET. China, I just got back in May, and it's just overwhelming when you consider the scale. So to globalize, you've really got to have a business model or a technology that has the capacity to scale, because if you go into the Chinese market, for example, the city of Shanghai is 4 times the size of New York City. You could drop 4 Americas inside the country of China. And if you can conquer the language and some of the cultural differences, there is a world of opportunity waiting for you to tap into that market. So I think we'll see some real explosions of the American technology entrepreneur in that area. Just make sure that you have really good copyright protections and make sure that no one's going to take your technology and do it themselves. All right, so with that, I'd like to turn to some question and answers. I'm going to start with just a couple of questions of the panel, and then pretty quickly we'll get into some audience Q&A. We have microphones on the left and the right, so give me a chance to ask maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then if you'd like to start lining up at the microphones, we'll call on you to ask questions. Let's come back to MOOCs just for a second, okay? Boy, there's been a lot of hype around MOOCs this last year. And a lot of excitement. There's really been some successes. Coursera has now announced that they've yielded $1 million in revenue. Mm-hmm. So the question about can they sustain economically is starting to become answered. But most of the MOOC discussion has really been in the higher ed space. I'm curious what your thoughts are on what does a K-12 MOOC look like? Howard?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think that it's what I would hope it would look like would be a combination both of platform accessibility, taking advantage of some of the innovations that some of these providers are creating, but really taking seriously the notion of how do you blend that. Obviously, there are different qualifications and different requirements when we're talking about K-12 in terms of privacy issues and so forth than we have at higher ed. This could be the blurring of the division between the end of high school and the beginning of community college or college. It could be a pathway. Are we talking about a new generation of qualifying exams? I mean, we had thousands of students, high school students on their own, with their districts, with their teachers, saying they wanted to do our courses to use those as demonstration of their ability to do college-level work. And so I think there absolutely could be space for that. What it would look like, obviously, I think I would come back to the notion of trying a next generation type of a blended environment, because I think students, what we heard and what I think you might have heard, still need that kind of combined environment, a socialized environment. Whether it's located in the same place or a much more enhanced network than some of the providers currently can deliver. In terms of content, there are ample stories of high school students winding their way through a variety of CS and engineering courses and so forth, and I think that will continue. I think there could be opportunities for more work in the humanities and more work in math instruction. There are obviously those gateway courses that many high school students are going to be looking for as freshmen or beginning students in colleges, and I think those are opportunities as well. At the end of the day, I think that the massive side of those MOOCs really has to be about the data, and the data stream coming back to what parents and guidance counselors and principals, instructional leaders will make sense of to help those students path their way through going into college. So absolutely, I think it's here. I think it's coming, but I think it needs the work and guidance of folks in this room.
So you don't just throw it out there on the internet and people learn. There's got to be that human instructor.
There will be throw it out on the internet and people will, maybe they'll learn something. I'm not sure. They may learn things that they didn't intend to learn. And then I think, we look at folks like Common Sense Media to think about how do you parse and understand the value of certain learning environments. So,
Linda, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a real question for me. I may be more of a skeptic about MOOCs in K-12, and I think you've got the theme of project-based learning, hands-on learning, experiential learning, where we know it needs to be, at least in the lower grades, scaffolded. you don't have a lecture model that we've all embraced over the course of the past couple decades. And in higher ed, it has felt like it is replacing and digitizing. It's almost like the equivalent to me of taking the lecture and digitizing it as opposed to incorporating newness. And I know that's evolving and there's more interactivity, et cetera, but
Right.
I would question where it belongs in K-12 and be a little bit more skeptical. The places where I've heard people get excited about it are around things like AP courses in high school. Many of the same places where virtual learning and virtual schools have played out well. So to me, it's a question of stepping back and saying, okay, what's the right learning design for different grade levels around these different subjects, and where do MOOCs fit into it, and do they really have as big a role here as perhaps something else that is more blended and integrative?
Okay, great. In education, we're always subject to a certain amount of government regulation. It takes the form oftentimes in higher ed through the accreditation bodies who are somewhat of an extension of the Department of Education. But in K-12, certainly we are under the microscope sometimes. What are your opinions with regards to some of the federal policy level movement that's happening that could either empower education entrepreneurs or hinder them as they begin to develop more technologies? What are some of the things that you're seeing around the Beltway? So.
It's a great question. I would start with some level of adherence or requirements around interoperability. I mean, if obviously testing is in 2014 and we have Common Core, I think the ability in the LMRI is a great start, a great effort there. I think, and I'm certainly not mandating federal requirements for adherence, but I think heading in that direction for both providers, users, choosers, to have that kind of interoperability so you can move that data in ways that make sense for those instructional leaders. I was talking with a superintendent up in Everett, Massachusetts, a working class town just north of Boston, and he was saying he has to deal with so many different data systems from providers of resources, services, and so forth, that he doesn't have time to actually be the instructional leader in his school to help the relatively inexperienced teachers in his building to learn and sharpen their craft. And he was looking for the type of interoperability that he said would make sense in any other industry.
Right.
So that would be my first place to start.
Okay, Linda?
2, E-rate 2.0, finding a way to really reform it, potentially increase the funding for it so that we actually have broadband access in schools across America. I think we all get a little, we're believers that the cloud exists. We're believers that broadband is broadly available. But if you actually go into schools, as many of you know, and look at what's really there, how can you honestly implement programs that are media rich that take a lot of broadband if it's not accessible? Right. So to me, that's number one. And I think that gives a big lift to almost everything else that comes behind it. The second would be privacy, the question that you're talking about. And I think we have to be really careful and bring the best minds to the table on this. I am someone who, in my organization, we work on privacy issues deeply. I believe that education is a carve-out in some of this. Data being used to enhance learning is a really important thing. The idea of kids being able to learn anywhere and everywhere and carry their data with them, I think, is incredibly powerful. So how do you come together and define policies and practices, both from the technology companies themselves, but also on the government side, that recognizes that we need to protect kids' privacy, but they also need to, this data needs to be shared with educators that can use it to make great decisions. So great. Those are the two that I'd like to see lots of emphasis on.
Thank you. I'll go to a question from the audience now. Yes, sir.
Yes, Scott. Frank Catalano. I want to play off something you talked about, which was mobile. I attended the GeekWire Summit earlier this month, and the CTO of HBO said that more than 60% of HBO Go's viewing is done on mobile devices now. And they've also discovered that the smaller the screen size, the less time spent with the content. You know, it's in smaller chunks. What I'm curious about is, in this audience here, a lot of people are probably still designing for the standard web browser access or standard screen size. When will we hit, in your mind, a tipping point or a flipping point, if you will, to where it should be mobile first is how content is developed and experiences are developed for the education market?
Well, I think the answer to your question is now, and it's happening. My company right now, for example, is in product development of a new online mobile learning app that was designed first and foremost for the phone. We're teaching ESL, English language, to predominantly foreign students, and we've designed an entire video game-based app that's downloadable through your traditional iTunes or Android platforms. And the real estate was designed and the game with that in mind. And actually the struggle that we're having is sort of reverse engineering it now for the PC and tethering those two together so that a student who may want to use multiple devices can pick up in the game where they left off from their home computer versus their phone. But we absolutely began from day one designing it for the iPhone. And everything else supports that because that's just where particularly people in the 18 to 25 demographic get their information. And as we did a lot of market research in China in particular, we're finding that unlike Americans where the phone is somewhat of an extension of oneself through social networking, etc., the Chinese culture uses the phone as really a window to the world and an extension to go and explore the rest of the world. And as a result, they're voracious consumers of information. And that statistic you threw out does not hold true in other cultures. In fact, in the Chinese market, they spend inordinate amount of time on their phones. So I think we have to look a little bit differently as Americans if we're going to design mobile learning apps for foreign markets. But I believe that what you're saying, for those who really understand mobile app delivery, that is happening today, and everyone else will quickly catch up. Good question. Thank you. Okay, if you have a question, just go ahead and come on up to the microphone. In the meantime, I'll come back over here. Linda, I'm kind of curious, just for the audience's information, what would you say are maybe like the three hottest things that you're seeing right now? What are some of your favorites with regards to either applications or new media products that are just really innovative and different and maybe outside the box? What would you say are your favorites?
Well, if I start by thinking about student instructional content, I really do focus these days on what's happening in terms of apps and games because of the engagement factor, because of the accessibility to lots of different teachers. So let me start there, and as opposed to kind of bigger courseware or devices. Mm-hmm. We're always looking for the hidden gems and trying to elevate those through, we actually have something called the On for Learning Awards.
Say that again?
It's called the On for Learning Awards, and we did it at the Games and Developer Conference last March and awarded, recognized some of the best games and apps developers. And in that mix were a number of small entities. One of them is Toontastic, which many of you may know, that's about basically digital storytelling using cartoons that I think does a great job. It's for kind of ELA in elementary. There's a brand new app that I would love everybody to go look at. It's called Learn with Homer. And it's for beginning to read. It's for kids age 3 to 6. What I love about this, it just, I think, published, it's an iOS app, just published about a month ago. What's beautiful about it is it's got the basics of phonics built in. It has, this developer hired something like 10 great illustrators. So it has the textual and texture of a book, beautifully illustrated, but the interactivity of an ebook. It has a component in which parents and kids learn together. It has the ability to go out to the internet and do various kinds of field trips. To me, it is kind of the best model of something that is a really integrated package that delivers the promise of what this could all be. So it's called Learn with Homer. I like a website, what is that one called? Design Squad. It's for kids, I think grades 3 through 8. It teaches engineering. I don't know if you've seen that. It also has great games and interactivity, and I think creates an element of competition that makes kids real designers. Those are a couple of them, but
great.
I can come back to more. What I think is exciting is that we can now look at lists of these, top lists of apps and games by subject area. We just produced something for special needs last year. So I think there's a whole lot of great stuff out there, some of it in the consumer space, some intended for K-12, that teachers can now incorporate into their lesson plan flows in an interesting way.
Great. Howard, you brought up the idea of open source, and that means different things to different people. And we've certainly seen in the higher ed movement, where you've come from, large university systems embracing open content and just really making their courses and their lessons free to anyone. In the K-12 space, which is very much dominated by the publishing industry that has a grip on content and wants to control textbooks, etc., do you see this movement of open source beginning to really open up? And if so, what does it mean for content providers and publishers here who are going to have to probably evolve and look at new monetization strategies to keep their content making money for their companies?
Well, I think it already has. I mean, I think some of the more forward-thinking platforms and providers have created environments where there can be, to some degree, a mix and match environment from resources that are OER-based to proprietary. I think the challenge on OER, obviously, is questions around the quality. And I think that is continuing to evolve. I think, recently, obviously, the Cal State system, the community college system announcing they want to publish produced content or research under Creative Commons licenses is one direction. And obviously, as you say, in K-12 space, it's different. So I don't think at the end of the day it's a one or the other. I think it's an and in both. I think it is a challenge both on the OER world to be able to find methods of production, methods of distribution, methods of creating things that can be reused and reshaped and rebuilt that maintain learning analytics and quality and data. And on the publisher side, I think it's a matter of finding those inroads and finding those partnerships. And I think there are certainly models that I think they're going forward, I think will look promising. I think that the tendency to sort of polarize and go in the opposite directions, I think, would be unhealthy. I don't think we should go back to that. I don't think it's an and. I don't think it's an either or. It's more of an and or both. The other part of that equation, though, is to plug in the role of the educators and teachers. And I think they also both need to understand the range and variety of what's out there, and also coming back to basic questions around professional development. How do you use these? How do you mix and match, and how do you use different resources in different ways? If we're talking about differentiated and personalized learning, the burden becomes greater on teachers to understand what is their palette of resources that they might be able to have access to. It's no longer that basal text provided just by the central office, and unfortunately it might be, but you want to extend beyond that. And I think teachers and instructional leaders in schools need help understanding what are the pros and cons here. And I think resources such as Common Sense Media is the absolute kind of requirement that I think those instructional leaders, principals, purchasers, central office folks should have their hands on.
Well, now that's an interesting topic, and I want to come around because both of you have sort of touched on that. There's so much out there, so much content, so many new apps. How do we train our education talent, our teachers? How do we find a way to train them in a way that we aren't just loading more and more in-service days? Are you seeing some companies that are rising up to sort of fill that gap of being able to teach teachers what are the hottest new applications and how to integrate them into their market? And can you name some specifics, companies that are maybe doing that, or is there an opportunity here for the people in this room?
Well, I think there is an opportunity around. I think the big challenge right now is how do you reshape creating instructional plans and lesson plans? If you are pulling from OER and if you're pulling an app and if you've got a basal courseware, how does that all get put together? I haven't yet seen people who have cracked the code. There certainly are deep resources which are focused on building teacher community, where there's a lot of best practice sharing, which I think is actually one of the most exciting things that's happening. So something like the teaching channel. If you think about people that are doing lesson plan, kind of crowdsourced lesson planning, like Better Lesson and LearnZillion are doing PD and development offline through TeachFests, et cetera. Common Sense Media has been, when we launched at ISTE, the graphite.org, the learning ratings, we had a room there where we were talking about all throughout the day, best apps for ELA 6th grade, and we had lines out the door. And what the teachers really wanted at the end of the day was they wanted to know how to discover great things, but they wanted to know how to piece them together. So we've been developing something called app flows that, but I think there are others in the audience who are thinking about this deeply. In terms of teacher training, I would love to hear the digital teacher core ideas get back into the mainstream conversation around policy. I think this is something at the policy level. It's been part of the LEAD Commission's recommendation. And you know, as I sat there last year thinking about, okay, every one of the ed tech companies has their distinguished teacher group. There is the Google Distinguished Educators and the Apple Distinguished Educators. Right. Is there an opportunity, and many of the same people are distinguished for many companies. Is there a way to bring together those folks and those resources in something that is more national in scope and scale, where we could really build a cadre of trainers and developers that could go out and in some way, shape, or form, leveraging technology, educate a greater proportion of the teaching public?
Great. Howard?
I love that idea. I'm preaching to the choir here. Just as a reminder, teaching is one of those things, or school is one of those things that we've all been there, so we're all apparently experts in it because we went through school, or some of us taught. We have to avoid that kind of conundrum. And I think we also avoid that we can't assume necessarily that these young teachers who are populating our classrooms are experts in pedagogical design or instructional design or knowing how to use this. They may have some affinity and some ability to multitask, which I think is, talk to my daughters, I tell them I think it's a myth. But we should remember that they also need that professional help. Those entry-level teachers who are flooded with a variety of things, they still need that instructional help. They still need to understand how do you parse data and how can you learn from the learner analytics to know what to be a chooser and user going forward. So I've seen situations where people will say, well, these teachers are really savvy because they're 22 or 23 and they have a Twitter account. Folks, we all know that that's not the case. They need that structured support, and I think this group can provide it.
Great. We've got just a few more minutes, so I'm going to end with one more question. If anybody, we have somebody here, so go ahead, sir.
Thanks. My name's Andy Calkins. I'm with Next Generation Learning Challenges. This is a great discussion. Thank you. And you're touching on a lot of the big building blocks that everyone in this room is going to have to think about. One of them that you've sort of danced around without ever really addressing full on is the whole question of procurement. There are a lot of, especially smaller app builders, who are just going right past the district procurement offices and marketing straight to teachers. And Linda, your comment just now about building a sort of a whole cadre of national exemplar teacher consumer PD providers and so on sort of points in the direction of a really broader informed consuming engine out there. So I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal balls and tell everybody in this room, 5 years from now, are they going to have to think in entirely different ways about how to reach the markets that they're trying to sell to? And are the days of principally going through district procurement offices going to be over? They're going to have to go to all thousands and thousands of teachers instead of hundreds and hundreds of districts.
Either of you like to take that first?
Sure, I'll start.
Great question.
It is a great question. I think we have to think about content along a spectrum of grain size, for lack of a better word. I think if you think about apps and games and even digital courseware, something like a Dreambox, I think you're going to see much more teacher involvement in selection, in discovery, in recommendations that go to the principal up through the district. I think experiments in giving people teacher wallets, this is something that the Gates Foundation has been involved in, and giving them, or Edmodo in their kind of app store, right. Giving teachers some flexibility and being part of the purchasing decision is disruptive and a very interesting experiment. On the other hand, I think we also believe that basal courseware, a year-long math course, may not go away tomorrow. The piecing together of different grain size of content is complicated. You need coherence, you need scope. And so at that level, it may be that there is still much more of a top-down decision-making apparatus. The way in which devices get embraced, think of LAUSD as an example, gives you pause. So I think it's too early to predict. I would hope, though, that what we're seeing is more empowerment at the teacher level, more informing of the decision up the line, some careful evaluation and research, as Karen pointed out, of, instead of just looking at things at the front end in terms of what might be high quality, looking at the outcomes at the back end and figuring out how decisions are made that engage both administrators and teachers. It'll also turn on how some of these business models shape out. I mean, if you think of an Amplify, which I actually think is a quite exciting model yes. Today, it's a quite simple business model. You go in and you've got one price per student, and it comes loaded up with everything, and then you don't have to worry anymore. If those kinds of models play out, you're thinking about more of a top-down situation. So I think the jury's out. What is exciting is that everybody is engaged in that conversation, and I think the more that educators broadly are engaged in that conversation, the better off we're going to be in terms of the solutions that come forth.
It's a great question.
Quick answer.
Quick answer. Crystal ball, what tells me that I think we'll see is a greater degree of transparency within that district or state level involving parents as well.
Yep.
And that a greater degree of not a district purchaser on high making a decision, but getting the teacher group in a district such as LAUSD or some of the obviously Chicago public schools or New York public schools, having a greater degree of a system that's built in, a smart system that's built in where people contribute more of the choice points, but getting parents involved to make those healthy decisions.
I will wrap it up with a very honest answer and push a few buttons as we finish this. I used to own a national supplemental education tutoring company during the heyday of No Child Left Behind. I have sold to schools and sold to schools and sold to schools in many, many states. I will never, ever do it again. Never. The cost and the headache involved in a national sales force is far beyond what it cost me to build a hot app and to market it directly to both teachers and students. Teachers today have such pressure to perform within their classroom that they will do just about anything to make sure that their students will perform, to include spending money out of their own wallet to make those students successful in their classroom. I will market directly to teachers and directly to students themselves and directly to their parents to make sure that those students are able to be successful. I will never sell to districts again. They're in the way and they don't know what they're doing. How's that for an answer? Okay, sounds great. Hey, thanks so much for being a part of this session. I hope we've given you some food for thought, maybe some new business angles to take into account with your own companies, and look forward to seeing you all around here at EdNET. Take care.
Thanks very much to the members of this panel. We're now breaking for lunch. It'll be right next door, and then we'll be back in this room for a session after lunch.